and welcome to Book Breaks. My name is Daniel Pecoraro. I'm one of the senior program managers here at the Global Learning Institute, filling in for Gina Oppenheim this week. This week, we're speaking with Michael Luo regarding his book, Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. A couple of reminders before we get started. Viewers like you make Book Breaks possible. Thank you. If you'd like to contribute to our program, you can follow the link that Jared will be putting in the chat, or email us to learn more. Thank you, as always, for your support of our program. As mentioned, my name is Daniel Pecoraro. I'll be your host this afternoon. Second half of the program moderated by Jared Guerin, our Book Breaks intern. Come on and say hi, Jared. He'll otherwise be in the chat for this first half of the program. And please introduce Michael Luo, an executive editor at The New Yorker, who writes regularly for the magazine on politics, religion, and Asian American issues. Joined The New Yorker in 2016 after 13 years at The New York Times, where he served as Metro reporter, national correspondent, and investigative reporter and editor. He is a recipient of the George Polk Award and a Livingston Award for Young Journalists, and is the author of this fantastic book, Strangers in the Land. Mr. Luo, welcome to Book Breaks. Great to have you here.
Excited to be here.
So can you give us an overview of the work to get us started?
The elevator pitch of the book is it's a narrative history of Chinese exclusion in America from the gold rush to the 1960s when my parents came to this country. It's the protagonists of the book are the Chinese people, and they're I like to think of them as protagonists in the story of America.
And so how did this topic and the research process come about for you and begin?
Yeah, so there's an immediate impetus for the book. I signed the contract to write this book in July of 2021, the summer of 2021. That was the pandemic. That was that period when we were seeing that surging violence against Asian Americans, the Atlanta spa attacks where several Korean immigrant women were killed by a white shooter had happened in the spring. And the immediate impetus to the book was I wrote a piece for The New Yorker that talked about this history of anti-Asian violence, in particular, this period known as the driving out in 1885, 1886, when nearly 200 communities in the American West expelled the Chinese violently in many cases from their communities. It was a part of our history that I actually didn't know anything about. And I drew on some books that are worth mentioning. Iris Chang's The Chinese in America is probably the closest parallel to this book. There's another book by Beth Lou Williams, a professor at Princeton, called The Chinese Must Go. There's also another book by an author named Jean Failser called The Driving Out that's worth mentioning. But there was actually a personal story that started this. That's that I talk about in the introduction to the book. This happened a few years earlier in the fall of 2016, October 2016. It was a kind of a personal encounter. Something that happened to me and my family. We were on the street it was a Sunday, actually right around now, on the Upper East Side after church, and we were with a group of friends, and we were, I guess, blocking the sidewalk. So imagine kind of a large group of Asian Americans, kind of lollygagging, I guess, on the sidewalk, and a woman brushed past us. A white woman brushed past us, and said to us, "Go back to China." And it was after church, but I didn't turn the other cheek. I'm ashamed to say I kind of abandoned my younger daughter in her stroller and kind of sprinted after this woman and kind of went back and forth, and she screamed down the block, "Go back to your effing country," in more colorful language than that. And I yelled back at her, "I was born in this country." It was just this really pathetic response. And that I ended up tweeting about that moment, and it kind of became this viral thing. And I used this hashtag, "This is 2016." I remember Bill de Blasio, the mayor at the time, kind of tweeted something back at me, kind of, trying to establish his bona fides of welcoming to the city. And I wrote a piece for the New York Times. There's an open letter to this woman who told me and my family to go back to China, and I wrote about this feeling of otherizing that's common and for a lot of Asian Americans, and I wrote about this sadness I felt that afternoon, just thinking about my kids, and even though they're two generations removed, my parents' immigrant experience, whether they ever feel like they truly belong in this country. Um, and I ended up sort of just doing a lot of interviews. I joked that I was the kind of face of Asian America for a week or two. And the thing that had stuck with me though is I felt a little bit of imposter syndrome as I did all these panels and interviews. Um, because I was just I was just a person where this event happened to, but I actually realized that I didn't really know a lot of the context and history that go into the Asian American experience and Asian American identity. Even though I'm a pretty educated, thoughtful person, but a lot of this history I didn't know, and that stuck with me. And that's when then the pandemic happened, and that moment where the kind of precarity of the Asian American experience was exposed, and that's what led to this book.
And I think one of the great through lines through this is the history of othering and the history of the
Yeah,
shifts in racial hierarchy, and in how it fits into the American mindset as
yeah,
well.
totally.
There's the long history of that, as you so deftly described both on the page and just now. To what extent did the arrival of Chinese immigrants alter the structures of racial hierarchy and our understanding of citizenship in this country?
Yeah, good question. So what a lot of people, when you think about the late 19th century, the mid 19th century, late 19th century, obviously you're thinking about um, the Civil War, the sectionalism, this struggle over the rights of American people, citizenship, and those kinds of questions. But and this a lot of that obviously was a very that was a focus of what was consumed the Eastern Seaboard. Obviously, the lead up to the Civil War and what happened after that. A lot of this played out as kind of America was expanding, and these questions of slavery in these new states and territories, and were a big part of that conflict. But there was on the West Coast, the gold rush. This where this book starts. I think really commenced this experiment in truly multiracial democracy that the country had not experienced before. It brought Chinese immigrants. There were obviously white Americans, European immigrants from a variety of countries. There were indigenous people. There were these people known as Californios, who were kind of Mexican, Hispanic settlers who became citizens after annexation. And and so the book is really telling the story of how we as a country responded when tens of thousands of people who did not fit into the existing racial stratification of the country, who spoke a different language, had a different religion. How do we respond as a country to that? How do we respond to that test? And we didn't do well. You mentioned citizenship. That was being debated, and the contours of citizenship were being debated after the Civil War, and the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. Obviously, those Reconstruction amendments were a big part of the story of the late 19th century. Fascinating thing is the Chinese figured into this debate. In 1870, a really crucial moment was this debate over who could become a naturalized American citizen. And the law governing naturalization, which had passed in 1790, limited it to essentially white men of good character. And there was this discussion and debate of whether the Chinese counted in that. In 1870, this could have been a moment actually that I think could have prevented a lot of the violence that came after, if because a lot of what protected, for example, Irish immigrants, I think who came around the same time as Chinese, is the fact that they eventually were able to accumulate political power, and they were able to become naturalized and vote and things like that. And in 1870, the Congress, when this came up, Chinese were excluded from that opportunity, and we kind of continue to see that debate playing out about who belongs in this family of citizens, who gets to be an American, is really the heart of the book.
And so setting the scene a bit further here, because you had mentioned the multiracial status of California at the time, what had immigration patterns from China looked like to the point of the beginning of the gold rush? And how was the gold rush an inflection point?
Yeah, not many. There might have been a handful of Chinese. Not very many Chinese had arrived before the gold rush, and so the gold rush set off this cycle of migration. It was kind of a transnational story. Word just spread, particularly in the southeastern part of China, in Guangdong province, in the area around the Pearl River Delta. It's this parcel of land that in Chinese is known as the Siyi, the four counties. This region, about the size of Connecticut, for some reason, really that powered the vast majority of this immigration. There's some debate among historians of why just this particular part of China drove so much of this migration. I think the best explanation is that Canton, it was close to Canton or Guangzhou, as it's known today, and Hong Kong, and those trading ports, and there was a lot of exposure to the West, and so so that the migration really starts to kick off in the gold rush, and then starts to really accelerate in 1868 with the kind of the signing of this thing known as the Burlingame Treaty, which basically both China and the Chinese Empire and the United States agreed to the principle of free immigration between their countries. This treaty was the product of a desire of kind of commercial interests in the U.S. to open up the Far East to trade. It was also a product of Christian evangelization kind of efforts in the Far East, and so that's when it really accelerated.
So in mentioning Burlingame, a couple of follow-up questions on that front. Who was Anson Burlingame, and what was his role in getting the treaty agreed upon and ratified, and what was the impact on Chinese arrivals to the country as a result?
Yeah, Anson Burlingame is a fascinating figure, because he was America's top diplomat in China, and when he was about to step down, or he was stepping down from his role, officials from the Qing dynasty approached him and asked him to become their ambassador to the U.S., to the West. It was a fascinating thing, and so he came to the U.S. with this. There was a huge sort of fanfare when his delegation arrived, first in San Francisco, and then traveled across the country to the East Coast, and ended up signing this treaty, negotiating it with William Seward, the Secretary of State at that time, and so him and this retinue of Chinese officials signed this really important treaty that, like I said, kind of affirmed the right of free immigration. And I think that was just a really pivotal moment, because if you look at the numbers of Chinese immigration, it really started to take off in that 1868, 1869, 1870 period. And that runs smack into actually an economic downturn that happened in the 1870s. I don't know if folks are aware of it, but before the Great Depression in the 1930s, there was something that was known as the Great Depression, and it was this period in the 1870s. And so when you this time of when you had all of these factories shutting down, and there were all these there were legions of white working men, as they called them, laborers, who were out of work. It was basically a cauldron of anger, really, that the Chinese who were landing on American shores in the 1870s found themselves stepping into and becoming scapegoats.
But one of the interesting things about the book is you show the shift from the initial goodwill towards Chinese Americans, and then the xenophobia that leads to not both legislation and the driving out movement. What were some of the factors that led to that shift, and was that initial goodwill in good faith, or was it just based on the evangelism and the economic
Yeah.
exploitation that was potentially at play here from the beginning?
Yeah, it's a good question, because yeah, it is interesting that in that very initial phase when the Chinese first started arriving after the gold rush, there was like a ceremony in San Francisco held by city leaders and pastors, really, who were among the civic leaders in San Francisco, welcoming the Chinese. And there was this kind of ceremony welcoming them in. They handed out Bibles, and there was like a parade where the Chinese marched in, and the notably when a really interesting artifact is this the daily the Alta California, which was the first daily newspaper um, in San Francisco and in California. Wrote this article kind of predicting that the Chinese were just going to become just like other immigrant groups, and they were going to vote, and they were going to become members of Congress one day, and things like that. It predicted this kind of lovely integration of people and races, and then obviously things shifted. I think what happened is it's easy to welcome people when there are a few of them. When there are more and more of them, and there was this this economic anxiety that was going on. And I should point out, uh, with 2020 retrospective, a lot of that anxiety was actually misplaced. Historians actually have and economists have looked at the labor market at that time, and concluded that really the Chinese and white workers were not really competing in the same labor pools. White workers were tended to be in kind of more lucrative jobs, and there's this fascinating working paper that was published within the last few years, recently actually, by some economists who looked at labor data, looked at the states where there were a lot of Chinese workers, and what happened after Chinese exclusion. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882 that barred Chinese laborers from entering the country, and they looked at economic outcomes. And basically, their conclusion is that a lot of the that what happened after the passage of Chinese exclusion is a lot of the synergies that were available, economic synergies that were available when there were both white workers and Chinese workers, were lost, and it did not lead to an uptick in economic outcome for white workers. And so, anyways, a lot of that was just misplaced anger. And so, yeah, the my best explanation is just more started coming, and that led to these tensions. I mean, one of the takeaways I think I have of the book is, maybe this is a big dumb conclusion, but I think difference is hard. I think when you think about it, just even in your own life, in your own friendship groups, in your workplaces, it takes intentionality to deal with these differences, and a difference is hard in our democracy. And difference is difficult for us as a country as a whole. It takes a lot of work and kind of putting your shoulder into it, and that's one of the big takeaways.
Absolutely. I have a question about that. Hopefully we'll have time to get to. There's a growing
Yeah,
number of questions in the Q&A, which is great to see so
yeah,
many folks active and really interested in this topic. But one of the other big themes that I found was of survivance and of
yeah.
resilience. And so to that end, a couple questions along those lines. How did mutual aid and other support groups for Chinese immigrants emerge and evolve as that community was growing?
Yeah. A really big factor in China for advocating for Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans was a conglomeration of mutual aid organizations that became known as the Six Companies, and it refers to these mutual aid associations that developed around mostly around geography, parts of that kind of southeastern Guangdong province. Um, there were specific counties and or specific language groups, dialects, where mutual aid organizations developed, and those organizations, which were made up of kind of, they were led really by these powerful, more educated merchants in a lot of cases, and they ended up doing really important things, like, for example, funding challenges to some of the laws that were discriminatory laws against Chinese, and funding court challenges against them. They also just took care of Chinese in their communities. Early on, if you arrived and you were new, they might front you some money to buy equipment so you could, be equipped to go out and go mining. They would do things like ship people's bones back to China if you died. Um, and so, yeah, these mutual aid organizations kind of grew up and became um, um, important advocates for their people, and are the and really just kind of a powerful example of organizing. Really, there was this push in 1892. There was a kind of a evolution of the exclusion laws called the Geary Act that required all Chinese to register with the U.S. government and be photographed. And the Six Companies actually organized a mass campaign of civil disobedience, and refused and encouraged everybody to refuse, all Chinese residents in the United States to refuse to register. And they funded a court challenge. Eventually, it made its way to the Supreme Court, and they lost. And the Chinese eventually did register. But it's an incredible thing to read about this national effort at civil disobedience. And they also asked everybody to donate $1 each towards this legal fund, and it's pretty incredible. So yes, the story, there's a lot of bigotry, violence, that the Chinese as a people navigated. But when I see the kind of arc of the Chinese story in America, it's a story of persistence and resilience. And I mentioned the driving out. They didn't succeed. This was an effort to for of white residents to take matters into their own hands, and they were upset that Chinese were still coming to America, even though these exclusion laws were passed, and they were trying to drive them out. And but the Chinese kept coming, and they in a lot of cases returned to some of these communities and found a foothold in America. And you start to see in the 20th century um, an emergence of a American-born generations and people who are asserting themselves, and like I said, protagonists in the story of America, pressing America to live up to its founding ideals.
Yeah. So there are some great questions here in the Q&A section. So I'm just going to wrap up with my last three, which are a bit
Okay.
more widely sweeping, and then
Yeah.
send things over to Jared to start with our History Scholar of the Week, and then dive into the many questions we have from the audience. What's one of your favorite narratives that you uncovered as part of writing this book? Perhaps one that in the many interviews you had about this about the books that's been published that
Yeah.
you haven't gotten a chance to speak about.
Yeah. I mean, I could think of so many. The one that the one that I've talked about that I think is just worth mentioning is because I think it's an example of how I try to write this book. And so I really try to center Chinese voices in the book. And you can your readers can tell me if I succeeded in that. It's challenging because um the archives, the history is written by the powerful, and the powerless are often, sadly, left out of history. And so you really have to hunt for those those voices. It's like sifting for gold. And one example I like to talk about is in my chapter I have on the massacre that took place in Los Angeles in 1871, where this is one of the worst mass lynchings in American history. There were 18 or 19 Chinese who were killed, most of them lynched. Um, there was an herbalist who was known as Jean Tong, and he spoke English, and so his story was more well known in the community. He was more widely known in the community. He actually rented a storefront at one point from a white furniture dealer, which is fascinating. And um, from the archives, what you're trying to do in that chapter, what I'm trying to do in that chapter, and what I'm trying to do in the book is kind of build him as somebody that you can kind of follow through that narrative of what happened in that horrific massacre. And in the archives, um, uh, you knew that he had a wife, that he had a roommate, that you knew a little bit about his storefront, and but I also knew that he had this pet poodle, which is just like this lovely humanizing detail, because that's what we need in I think in this into to as readers, but also I think um, in general as kind of humanity, we need to kind of be able to move past immigrants and kind of strangers as abstractions, and kind of get to know them as people. And the reason I know that he had this pet poodle was he was lynched, and afterwards his apartment was ransacked, and a reporter went through his apartment, and there was blood everywhere, detritus everywhere, and there was this poodle whimpering under a table with a broken leg. And so that's the kind of humanizing detail that I'm going after. That's like, as an author, that's the gold that I'm looking for.
Thank you so much for sharing that, pulling that out of the book and into this conversation. How do you think teachers can utilize this work either on its own or in conversation with some of the primary sources you found as part of your research, or some of the other works in the historiographical record in their
Mm.
classrooms to talk about Chinese American history?
Well, I mean, first, I do, I love the saying Asian American history is American history. And um, when you think about these basically kind of country Western stories. Like these are the story of the American West really is this story in the 19th century. Um, the thing I would say is, well, one, there's 160,000 words in the book and 40,000 words of endnotes that are go that point you to a lot of primary sources. And I think what is well, one thing I think that I benefited from as an author is the leaps in digitization that have happened um, since really since COVID. So many institutions got so good at digitizing their archives because archives were closed for a while, and many of them posted these things online, documents online. The some of these episodes, for example, the driving out that happened in Seattle and Tacoma, the University of Washington has put online, many documents. Some of them, some of the documents that I call upon are only available in other forms that I had to ask. Either I had somebody pull them for me, or I was physically at some of these archives to photograph them and scan them. Um, but that's the amazing thing at this point is you can pick an episode, a chapter in the book, and um, consult some of these documents. If you subscribe to newspapers.com or genealogybank.com, it's pretty amazing. You can search Chinese exclusion and pull up all the headlines from 1881, 1882 to understand how this was being discussed in American media. Um, so your ability nowadays to kind of read a document, a book like mine, and dive in yourself, look at my endnotes, consult some of these repositories is it's pretty unprecedented. It's an incredible moment to be able for the teaching of history and for historians in general.
Absolutely. The digitization of resources, including, not to brag, from the Gilded Learning Institute, also useful as well. I'm going to hand things over to Jared for our History Scholar of the Week and for other questions from the audience. Take it away, Jared.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you so much, of course, for joining us today on Book Breaks, Michael. It's my privilege to be able to host the audience questions portion of Book Breaks today. And we have a great collection of questions so far. If anyone has any additional questions for Michael Luo today, you can submit a question using the Q&A feature right here on Zoom, and it may be asked live in this half of the program. But before we get to those audience questions, we first have a question from our History Scholar of the Week. This is a weekly competition in which students may ask our guests a question for a chance for themselves and their teacher to win a $50 gift card to the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. Our history scholar for this week is Markins from Union High School in New Jersey. And he asks, how do you think the Chinese American struggle for civil rights and belonging compares to other civil rights movements in American history? And what lessons can today's society learn from their perseverance and activism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can answer in a couple of different ways. Um, I guess I will say that I think the story of the um, uh, rights for African Americans, for example, which was happening at this same moment, it's very kind of intertwined with the debate over rights for Chinese immigrants. Like one of the fascinating um, things that I didn't know was that the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, which gave um, African Americans the right to vote, formerly enslaved African Americans the right to vote, was nearly derailed because people particularly on the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, were concerned that this would lead to Chinese being able to vote. And it actually was one of the reasons that it took a long time for California to ratify the 15th Amendment. The other thing I think that comes to mind from your question is how I think there should be kind of kinship and allyship among different groups, because when you think about we didn't talk about Wong Kim Ark and birthright citizenship, but that was at the end of the 19th century, it was a case involving a Chinese man named Wong Kim Ark, who was born in San Francisco, whose case went all the way to the Supreme Court, that established the legal precedent of birthright citizenship, and that has paved the way for any number of people and immigrant groups to become American citizens when they're the kind of generation is born in the United States. But then I also think about my book ends in really in the 1960s with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which followed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But obviously, understanding that history and the way that the rights that were fought for by Black Americans in the 1960s benefit Asian Americans today is really important historical context, and helps kind of bind together a variety of different people groups and minority groups, and so when you understand the history and the context of all this, I think it builds kinship really among people.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that question, Markins. And thank you, Michael, for the thoughtful answer as well. If you are a student or you know a student who wants to submit a question, you can do so with the form found on our GLI Book Breaks homepage. But now we're getting right into the audience questions. So first up, Erin is wondering, towards the beginning of the program, you mentioned that some other academic literature like The Chinese
Yeah,
Must Go, and then, Erica Lee and May
I
Nye.
know. Yeah.
He was just wondering, how do you see your book fitting in with the current academic literature? Do you see it as, like, increasing the understanding of the field as a whole, or
Yeah,
bringing it to a broader audience?
love that question. All of those works are huge. The Chinese Must Go, mentioned by Beth Lou Williams, incredible book. May Nye is a giant in the field, has written a number of books, including one, The Chinese Question, that came out recently, that covers some of this same ground. And Erica Lee is another giant in the field. I should have mentioned also Gordon Chang, who wrote this incredible book about the railroad called The Ghost of Gold Mountain. I think what I'll say is two things. One is, as a journalist, I think my role is as a storyteller, and I bring an approach to the writing that's particular to my background as a New Yorker writer and editor, and also as an investigative reporter and kind of narrative feature writer. And so I think when you read my book and you look at the way chapters are constructed, the way it's built around characters and scenes, the way sections are kind of built, and there's kind of a narrative structure of of kind of rising tension, and I'm looking to kind of this kind of emotional heart of this book is this driving out period, and writers, you think about this kind of three-act structure where a protagonist confronts a series of complications, and there's kind of this climactic moment, and there's kind of this resolution, and that's what I see interestingly in the story of the Chinese America in this period that I cover. The other thing I'll say is I think anyone who writes a history writes it in a certain context and writes it in a certain moment. And I mentioned Iris Chang's book, The Chinese in America, which, to be honest, actually, it's an incredibly written book, gorgeous book. I had never read it. I had never. I knew Iris Chang from The Rape of Nanking, and for some reason, I didn't know this book. And I actually think that that's not uncommon. And Iris Chang, if you're not familiar with her story, she committed suicide soon after the publishing of this book, and maybe that's one reason that it's not as widely known. It's a very sad story. There was kind of speculation that she had absorbed so much kind of trauma from the reporting and of these two books. But the other thing I'll say is, like, so she published that 25 years ago, around 2001, I think 2002, and she kind of writes this. She comes all the way up to present day. I really was trying to write a narrative history of Chinese exclusion, and I was writing out of a moment in that kind of moment of anti-Asian violence about this precarity of the Asian American experience, and I wanted to um, explain that, and I wanted to explain how it wasn't new, and throughout, even though we've been here for nearly, 200 years, really, we have been told to go back to our country again and again. And I just think that that's the context with which I was writing. And I think if you read my book, I think I approach the history with that frame. And that's what one of the things I think that sets the book apart from the existing literature, which I'm incredibly grateful for. And I'm hoping through the book that more people look to and um, pick up those books.
And we thank you for sharing your story, as well as, the story that's been building for centuries now, especially since the exclusion's been,
Mhm.
documented through these other authors and everything. So thank you for
Mhm.
bringing it all together under one roof, it seems, too. Combining a few questions here. Adam is wondering about push factors for the 19th century of Chinese immigrants.
Yeah.
And then Gary Kunzman wants to add on to that, asking about where if there were any trends of immigration in terms of like region, religion. And then finally, Eric's also wondering if any of these regional animosities carried over to the US from China. So sorry.
Yeah, so some of
Everything
some
with
of the
that.
push factors, yeah, that's a good question. Some of the push factors related to some of the turmoil that was going on in China. There was the Taiping Rebellion, where millions of Chinese were killed. There was this in that part of China, southeastern part of China, there was this ethnic conflict that was internecine ethnic conflict that was brewing, and there were other factors like drought and things like that that were kind of push factors. Obviously, the pull factors relate to economic opportunity, and it was first the discovery of gold. There's this kind of maybe it's an apocryphal story, but there's this story of the first. There's a story of a merchant who had been in the country as early as 1847. I think this was kind of lore that was handed down in the Chinese community. A guy named Cheng Ming, and he supposedly was one among the folks who went into the foothills of Sierra Nevada, wrote home to his village, and somebody there, a fellow villager, told others, and then set off across the country, across the ocean himself. And this supposedly was the kind of story of how word spread. There's other more easily verifiable historical facts of, like, the arrival of a ship carrying gold from California in Hong Kong, and Hawaiian had Hawaiian newspapers with stories of the gold rush and things like that. So yeah, there were push factors and pull factors. Obviously the other big thing that a lot of people know about is the need for labor with the building of the railroad, and interestingly though, Gordon Chang talks about how at least initially much of the Chinese workers who worked on the railroad were recruited in the United States, and kind of these were people who were here. The gold mine, the minefields had started to kind of dry up, and they were looking for other opportunities. But the railroad executives, the Central Pacific, loved the Chinese workers and their work ethic, and really sought to bring as many over as they could. And then the other thing I did mention was it seems to be that this part of southeastern China and Guangdong province was just kind of unusually familiar with the West and used to kind of interchange and intercourse with the West compared to the rest of China, which seemed to make them more comfortable with the idea of going back and forth. It really was kind of a transnational story in those days of people going back and forth.
Gotcha. And now, kind of shifting gears, at least forward in time, Sam is wondering if you could talk about the role of New England congressional opponents to the Chinese Exclusion Act. These are, senators. And then Diane was
Yeah.
specifically wondering if Senator Hannibal Hamlin of Maine had a connection with the Chinese community, or if he just voted against the Exclusion Act for the sake of, championing progressive politics.
Yeah, I don't think, well, Hamlin is this incredible figure who shows up in the book as kind of this opponent of this guy, James Blaine, who was another Maine Republican who was the story of what happened to the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, who fought to free the slaves and stood for liberty and equality, and how that party became just as vociferous and ugly in its characterization of the Chinese and aggressively championing the exclusion of the Chinese as Democrats were, who were, the party that, was trying to vanquish Reconstruction, and where it makes a little bit more sense, where they spoke in these ugly racial tropes. The story of what happened to the Republican Party and is a fascinating one. It relates to the fact that uh, the country was so evenly divided politically, this polarization that was happening, and in order to kind of achieve kind of party supremacy, win the presidency, control Congress, they really needed the West. Both parties kind of started to cater to that anti-Chinese sentiment in the West Coast, and kind of were vying for who could be uglier in their rhetoric about the Chinese. And James Blaine was kind of one of these ambitious, um, shameless politicians, I think, who in 1871 was trying to pass this really ugly bill called the 15 passenger bill, and he had aspirations for the presidency, and Hamlin shows up in the book as somebody who takes him on actually, and defends the Chinese, and he's kind of this elder statesman. There are a bunch of New England Republicans. George Frisbee Hoar is another one that comes to mind, who were among the rare examples of Republicans or really politicians of any party who stood up for the Chinese. Hoare is, maybe comes across in my book as one of the most principled defenders, a descendant of, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and just, and honestly, in his old age, kind of just didn't care, and just kind of and really was kind of just a principled defender of the Chinese all the way up until when Chinese exclusion was made permanent just after the turn of the in the early 1900s. He was the lone dissenting voice, a lone dissenting vote in the Senate, and really kind of a paragon of the principles of equality.
And kind of speaking on this subject, Adam was wondering if you want to discuss any of the presidents in office at the time. I remember seeing in your book, one of the middle chapters, that although Arthur signed it into law, of course, this was only like brought to his desk because of the death of Garfield and so on. So just wondering if you wanted to discuss any on the, executive side.
Yeah, I mean, no one particularly acquits themselves well. Like and often it's kind of political. It's because of what was going on politically at this point. Like I think about actually one person for some reason that kind of springs to mind is Ulysses Grant, who kind of presided over the signing of the Page Act, which was kind of a predecessor to Chinese exclusion, which was this law that targeted Chinese prostitution and basically said that any women who were coming for lewd or immoral purposes were excluded, and essentially made it impossible for Chinese women to enter the country. And Grant was kind of in his second term was kind of having, it was a difficult period for his presidency, particularly with the the economic downturn that was afflicting the country. And yeah, and he was settled on this kind of scapegoat, the Chinese, and that's really the story of our politics today.
For sure, for
And
sure.
then, yes.
Sam's wondering, could you talk about the push that in 2011 successfully convinced the US Senate to finally apologize for the Chinese Exclusion Act? I'm not sure if you saw that in your research at all.
Oh yeah, I don't cover that. And yeah, so eventually there was an apology, and it's interesting how history works. I think one of the things that when people have asked about kind of progress and hope, the pandemic and the surge in violence against Asian Americans led to a number of actually cities, San Jose, Los Angeles, a couple other cities issued apologies to the treatment about the treatment of Chinese during this period, and there has been some efforts to stepped up efforts to memorialize these events. I mentioned in my earlier the massacre that took place in Los Angeles. Right now, there's just this tiny little plaque. It's really kind of pathetic that marks that massacre. But after in the last couple of years, there was a push to erect a much bigger, more elaborate memorial, and the city had this kind of process and competition, and they've selected this extraordinary memorial design, and now they're raising money for it. And so you're seeing kind of a new consciousness about this history, and hopefully this book can be part of that.
And I know you were saying that your book doesn't exactly cover that. Emily loved your presentation in the comments and is wondering if you have any intentions of writing a volume two that maybe continues to the present. Maybe this is only a little selfish of me to ask this because I'm curious as well, but
Yeah, no, that's a great question. um, when I first signed the contract with this book, I actually thought I might end up only writing about that driving out period, that kind of late 19th century period, because when you're a narrative writer, oftentimes making your lens, making the aperture smaller is actually more productive because it allows you to kind of drill in more. It was actually my editor, Chris Popolo at Doubleday, who really pushed that I expand the scope. And I mean, this gives you a little bit of a glimpse into the way publishing works. Doubleday is obviously a big five publisher. They want to sell books. They want to reach a general audience, a mass market, and they really like to be able to say when the book is from the 19th century, the mid 19th century to the 1960s, when the author's parents came to America. They like to be able to say that in the selling of the book. The reason I didn't cover the after the kind of post 1965 migration, which is actually my personal history, is it's really a different book, and it's a different set of dynamics. Although I think one of the things that I come away from this history is this. I used to think that this story, this migration that happened in the 19th century, wasn't my story. That these are people who spoke a different dialect of Chinese than I speak. They speak Cantonese, they speak Toisanese, they spoke Hakka. I speak Mandarin. When you look at the photos from that period, the men wear these queues, these long braids, and you just feel a sense of difference. But when you really start to again move past the abstraction, really get to know these people and their experiences, you do feel a lot of similarities and parallels to present day, and I think that's one of the things I came away with, and I hope people come away with in the book. But yeah, it's a different history. It would be a different challenge. It would be a little bit more like a book that I maybe then maybe this betrays a little bit of hubris or whatever. But when we sold the book, we're like, I want to do for Chinese migration what Isabel Wilkerson with The Warmth of Other Suns did for the Great Migration. And the difference is that Isabel Wilkerson was able to interview, like 900 people who remembered the Great Migration. This history goes back a lot further, and requires kind of document-based work in the archives. I think the story of the post 1965 story would be much more heavily around interviews and talking to people.
For sure, for sure. And I'm sure so many people, based on the number of comments we've gotten, would love to hear that story. And so
Yeah.
just closing out with one final question, which touches on one of the quotes that you had mentioned earlier, and I actually had written down in my phone separately. History is written by the powerful, and the powerless are left out of history. Denise is wondering, how do we elevate more of these marginalized voices and histories in teaching that K through 12 social studies, especially in this tenuous environment?
Yeah, so I guess I would just say read.
For
I mean,
sure.
I mean that's the thing. There's been a lot of questions about young people in my book events, and one of the things I talk about is what I'm just worried about for the young people, and I have a 16-year-old and a 11-year-old, is attention spans and reading, and the reading of history, and so all we can do to celebrate books and reading, I don't even actually care if it's historical fiction, if it's nonfiction history. The biggest thing I think that we can do to elevate these stories is to continue to fight for institutions like this one and others, libraries, the New York Public Library, all these historical societies that are promoting historical literacy and the reading of history and the writing of history. I just think that it's so important.
Absolutely. And we do not have quite enough time to get to everyone's questions today, but I encourage our audience to pick up a copy of Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America to find your answers and an incredibly well-written book over at the Gilder Lehrman Bookshop. So before I pass it back to Daniel for just some closing remarks, I just want to say that it was a pleasure to speak with you today, Michael, and thank you for joining us today on Book Breaks.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so very much indeed. And thanks to Jared for keeping the energy going and for the great questions from the audience this afternoon. As a reminder, the History Scholar of the Week, every week we select a middle or high school student, their question asked on the air, them and their teacher receive a $50 gift certificate for use in the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. Students also receive an extra credit certificate. Your mileage may vary on that one, but there you go. As Jared mentioned, you can purchase a copy of Strangers in the Land at our bookshop at bookshop.org. Pro tip, bookshop.org now has ebooks as well. So I actually read this electronically on my tablet. The affiliate commission we receive on books through our bookshop supports programming for history teachers and students, programs like this one. Next week on Book Breaks, we have Etta Fields Black talking about Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combee River Raid, and Black freedom during the Civil War. That is next week, same time. 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. You can go to gilderlehrman.org/bookbreaks to sign up and to explore our archive of more than 250 hours of scholar presentations spanning at this point over 5 years. You can go to gilderlehrman.org for historical documents from our collection, our essays, and our journal History Now, nominating a teacher for the National History Teacher of the Year Award, online exhibitions, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Hope to see you here next week. Otherwise, hope you have a great week ahead. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. So long, everyone.